The date is September 26, 1983, a date that was designated for human history to potentially cease, a date now shrouded by the chilling, solitary defiance of one man. In a forgotten subterranean bunker near Moscow, Soviet Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov watched the world end, and he was the only one who saw it begin. This vast, concealed complex was the Serpukov 15 Command Center, the nerve hub of the Soviet early warning system, a machine built not for rational strategy, but for reflexive, unthinking vengeance. The facility itself was a masterpiece of Cold War paranoia, driven 6 stories deep beneath layers of reinforced concrete and granite, armored against the blinding light and devastating electromagnetic pulse, EMP, of a nuclear detonation. It operated in a state of perpetual, strained silence, a profound quietude that always felt like the held breath of a massive, resting beast. The artificial lighting was harsh, unblinking fluorescent white, yet the air temperature was deliberately held low, creating a climate of nervous, chilled efficiency among the skeleton crew who knew that their singular, terrible purpose was to be perfectly reliable in the face of oblivion. Every wire, every switch, and every console screen in that bunker was a commitment to the doctrine of instantaneous war. At 12:40 a.m., in the dead hours of the night when rational human vigilance is at its lowest and the capacity for critical thought is dulled by fatigue, the stillness of the room, already thick with the metallic, acrid smell of ozone and stale machine oil that clung to the recycled ventilation system, was suddenly pierced by a sound that bypassed the ear and attacked the very core of the human heart, the terrifying, blaring siren signaling a confirmed missile launch. The sound was not a simple buzzer. It was a penetrating, high-frequency wail, an electronic shriek of existential dread, designed to silence all thought and trigger pure, immediate military reflex. The main screen at Petrov's console, the electronic judge of global survival, built of cold, unforgiving vacuum tubes and analog circuits, flashed one word in stark, furious red: start. Every light in the enormous, low-ceilinged room seemed to shift hue, instantly casting a desperate, blood-red tint onto the pale, startled faces of the duty crew. The ceiling lights seemed to pulse with the manic rhythm of the siren, mirroring a frantic electronic heartbeat. The machine was working perfectly. Its systems had passed every diagnostic, every check, every simulated catastrophe, assuring the Soviet High Command of its absolute infallibility. The data streaming from orbit was irrefutable. An American Minuteman, 3 Intercontinental Ballistic Missile, ICBM, had been launched from a base in the continental United States. The OCO satellite data was not merely plausible, it was precise, confirmed, and digitally encoded, leaving absolutely no margin for human error in the sensor readings or transmission. The system gave the Soviet Union just 25 minutes to decide on total war, 25 minutes for the fastest jet to fly 1/4 of its global range, 25 minutes for human civilization to reverse half a century of scientific progress and return to a geological age of cinders. That countdown clock, now visible on a secondary screen, began its silent, terrifying descent, the seconds burning into Petrov's peripheral vision. Petrov, a man whose military rank was relatively low, but whose pulse put his hand directly on the hair trigger of human history, felt a cold dread that wasn't panic. It was the chilling, professional calculation of inevitability. He was a master of procedure, a man whose career had been built on following instructions. Now, every procedure, every political directive, every high-fidelity simulation he had ever run, from the most junior exercise to the Politburo-mandated drills, demanded that he pick up the heavy red telephone on his desk and confirm the attack to the Kremlin. The weight of that crimson receiver, symbolizing the direct, unmediated link to the highest authority, the General Secretary, was the weight of the entire world's fate resting on his 5 fingers. Once he did that, the complex, automated chain of command, which was deliberately designed to execute, not question, in the face of imminent destruction, would almost certainly launch the Soviet Union's own devastating, retaliatory counterstrike. For 60 agonizing seconds, the air tasted of molten metal and static electricity. The machine demanded war, the entire Soviet military doctrine demanded war, and the political tension of the year demanded war. Yet, the world did not burn. The silence that followed that initial, terrifying blare was an impossible result. The terrifying question was immediate, and it was the deepest secret of the entire Cold War. The system was working perfectly, yet the world did not burn. Why? The answer lay somewhere between the cold, logical perfection of the microchip and the flawed, stubborn, and desperately human complexity of one man's mind. The year 1983 itself was a powder keg lit with a dangerously short fuse, a reality felt far more keenly inside the underground bunker than by the average citizen above. The geopolitical atmosphere was colder, more volatile, and more paranoid than at any point since the Cuban Missile Crisis 20 years prior. The prevailing doctrine of mutually assured destruction, MAD, meant that the stability of the global order was a terrifying bluff, and the status quo was one electronic flicker, one miscalculation, away from total apocalypse. The sheer, terrifying speed of modern nuclear war meant both superpowers were irrevocably committed to a launch-on-warning strategy, accepting the horrific reality that the decision to end the world would be made by machines and junior officers, not heads of state. The window for human reflection had been technologically eliminated. The Soviet Union's leadership was consumed by the conviction that the United States, under President Ronald Reagan, was preparing a first strike, a preemptive attack designed to destroy the Soviet retaliatory capacity. This paranoia was meticulously cultivated and disseminated through internal propaganda and military briefings, fueled by Reagan's aggressive rhetoric, including his public condemnation of the USSR as the evil empire. This phrase was repeated in command centers not as political rhetoric, but as strategic proof of American malice. The increasing American push for advanced weaponry, particularly the proposed Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI, quickly dubbed Star Wars, was universally viewed in Moscow not as a potential defensive shield, but as a technological key to rendering Soviet retaliation useless, thus clearing the path for an American first strike. This perceived technological gap amplified the sense of being under a constant existential siege. The entire apparatus of the state was geared for the swift, total eventuality of a sneak attack. This deeply rooted fear wasn't baseless. Just weeks earlier, Soviet fighter jets had shot down Korean Airlines Flight 007, killing 269 people, including a sitting U.S. congressman. The U.S. immediately denounced the act as unforgivable and barbaric. The resulting diplomatic fallout created an atmosphere of pure, venomous distrust, poisoning all military-to-military communication. The Soviet High Command understood that any subsequent perceived threat would be interpreted by Washington through this prism of recent bloodshed. The military response to any subsequent perceived threat was sharpened to a razor's edge, demanding immediate and unquestioning escalation. Furthermore, in just over a month, NATO was set to launch Able Archer 83, a massive, highly realistic command post simulation of a nuclear escalation that the Soviets genuinely believed might be a deception layer for a real attack. The simulation's use of real command elements, new code words, and strict radio silence protocols perfectly mirrored the steps leading to actual conflict. The entire Soviet defense was balanced so finely that the only thing required to tip it was a single electronic lie, a flicker of infrared light that appeared to betray the truth. The proximity to war was absolute, but the secret that saved the day was not a diplomatic treaty. It was something deeper, something quietly human. To understand Petrov's solitary heroism, one must first grasp the absolute certainty demanded by the Soviet system. The military culture he operated within was fundamentally different from the cautious hesitation he was now experiencing. This was a world where uncertainty was a capital crime. Doubt was treason. A commander's career was built on the meticulous elimination of doubt, on the execution of prescribed procedure with the cold finality of steel meeting steel. Nuance was considered a dangerous, counter-revolutionary indulgence when facing the implacable enemy. The expectation was total, unwavering commitment to the machine's immediate verdict. The command center itself was a microcosm of this rigid doctrine. Everything was redundant, verified, and triple-checked. The equipment was designed to be fail-safe, meaning that any warning that successfully bypassed all the initial filters was to be treated as 100% truth. The consoles were built not by trusting engineers, but by skeptical patriots whose only metric of success was absolute reliability. They had engineered a system that could not lie and therefore could not be ignored. The atmosphere in the bunker was one of controlled, predictable stress until the siren broke the pattern. When the siren wailed, it wasn't a suggestion, it was an order. passed from the most trusted eyes in orbit to the highest authority on the ground. Petrov knew that the moment he relayed the alert, he was handing the destiny of mankind to men far less practiced and nuanced than he was. The generals and Politburo members waiting further up the chain were not staring at technical readouts. They were staring at a 30-minute clock counting down to Soviet obliteration. Their orders, pre-signed and sealed years ago, demanded a massive, overwhelming retaliation to save the motherland. Petrov's only shield was the thin veneer of his own common sense, the quiet voice that argued against the consensus of an entire superpower. The sacrifice of his own career was, at that moment, the minimum price for the possibility of global survival. The weight was unbearable, yet he could not allow the machine to make the final, fatal decision without his authorization. He was the final human lock on the door. The technological architect of this particular nightmare was the Soviet Early Warning Satellite System, OKO, Russian for Eye. These were not simple, conventional cameras taking wide-angle photos of the planet. They were cutting-edge, highly specialized infrared sensors floating silently in vast, highly elliptical Monio orbits. The very nature of this system was a testament to Soviet engineering ingenuity, designed to solve the critical problem of providing maximum reaction time. The satellite's purpose was singular and terrifyingly precise: to provide the longest possible warning time, up to the crucial 30 minutes, by detecting the immense thermal signature of an American missile launch almost immediately after it cleared its silo and began its ascent. The Monio orbit was crucial. Its design allowed the satellites to spend most of their time high above the northern hemisphere, constantly sweeping the horizon for the white-hot plume of an American ICBM launch against the dark, cold backdrop of space. It was the nation's final tripwire, an electronic sentry that never slept and whose reported reliability was beyond reproach. This system occupied the ultimate high-ground observation point, and the data it relayed was meant to be the unvarnished, ultimate truth, bypassing all the slow, flawed human interpretation of earlier defense generations. The system had a singular, frightening purpose. It was designed only to see threats, not context. We can give the system a chilling psychological profile: the eye of the scared. It was built to confirm the Soviet Union's greatest, most deeply ingrained fear: the surprise first strike. The sensors were tuned exclusively to detect the immense, rapid thermal signature of solid fuel rocket plumes as they punched through the atmosphere, meticulously filtering out all other atmospheric noise and ground-based heat sources, leaving only the signal of existential danger. The data processing at the Serpukhov 15 bunker was brutal in its simplicity. Any heat signature matching the spectral fingerprint of a solid-fuel Minuteman III launch plume was tagged, tracked, and immediately relayed to the Central Command. The officers who monitored it, including Petrov, trusted the system implicitly because their entire national defense strategy depended on its flawless function. They were convinced that if the eye reported a launch had occurred. To question the OKO system was not merely to question a piece of hardware, it was to question the entire military viability of the Soviet state and the brilliance of its defense engineering. But the OKO system, for all its technological mastery and single-minded focus, had an inherent, almost poetic flaw: a specific vulnerability to certain solar alignments. The system relied on the stark contrast between the ICBM's hot plume and the cold backdrop of Earth in space. However, twice a year, for periods that lasted several hours, the satellite's orbits placed them directly in line with intense sunlight reflecting off high-altitude cloud formations. This specific geometric coincidence created an optical ghost, a massive, transient heat signature that the digital sensors, calibrated only for the threat of a missile, were unable to distinguish from the thermal signature of a rocket engine. This was a known, though statistically rare, blind spot, a detail that was often minimized or dismissed as a fringe technical quirk in the face of the system's overall reliability. It was understood to be a simple noise filter problem, not a war indicator, but the political climate ensured that all human judgment filters were deactivated. The orders were clear: if the machine said, "Start," you relay "Start." Petrov had received detailed briefings on this technical flaw during his training. It was filed away in the dusty corner of his mind reserved for low-probability, theoretical scenarios. Yet, In the white-hot urgency of the moment, no officer was expected to second-guess a computer whose entire purpose was to protect the nation from destruction. The weight of the world demanded speed, not astronomical analysis. Yet, it was this tiny, almost forgotten piece of technical lore, a simple geometric angle involving the sun, the cloud tops, and a piece of orbital hardware, that would soon become the key to the secret code word that saved the world. The terrifying alert started with a single launch. A single, distinct missile plume rising from an American base. Petrov's job was to assess the warning's reliability, a task that required him to fight against the system's own design, which was intended to suppress skepticism and promote instant reaction. He checked the ground-based radar systems, which were the necessary backup, but they reported nothing, yet. The radar installations, part of the older, slower confirmation network, could only track missiles once they rose above the curvature of the horizon, meaning that for the first crucial minutes of the 25-minute window, Petrov's sole, terrifying truth lay with the infallible verdict of the Oko satellites. The fate of the world was hanging on data only he could see, data that bypassed the traditional, time-consuming confirmation methods used by earlier defense generations. He logged the single launch, trying desperately to adhere to procedure, even as his mind raced. His professional instinct argued with his training. A single missile could be an isolated computer error, a test gone awry, or even a rogue submarine captain acting on his own initiative. It was a terrifying ambiguity, but one that still allowed for a pause. Then, moments later, the console went from bad to unspeakable. The siren wailed again, the pitch rising to a frantic, piercing shriek that was physically painful, demanding immediate obedience, and the screen flashed, "Launch," a second time. The air in the bunker suddenly felt frigid and thin, the silence from his subordinates heavy and absolute, broken only by the relentless wail. Then a third, a fourth, and a fifth. The screens now confirmed 5 launches, and the probability indicator spiked to a maximum level reading, high probability. The sequential nature of the launches was terrifying. It implied coordination, not malfunction. A single missile launch could be dismissed as an anomaly. 5 launches constituted an unmistakable pattern. It was the chilling signature of a concerted, decapitating first strike, the exact scenario the Soviet system was designed to repel with immediate, overwhelming retaliation. The computer's logic was now flawless, comprehensive, and undeniable. The number was massive, the threat was instant, and the protocol demanded action. Every single officer in the command center now believed they were under nuclear attack. Petrov's duty was now simple and terrifying. Confirm the computer's assessment and pass the chain to the higher command, who would launch. The system had effectively eliminated the human element, leaving Petrov only the final, automated step. His confirmation was the single human action required to authorize the annihilation of the West and guarantee the retaliatory destruction of the East. The clock was still ticking, and the system demanded action. He needed a code word, a piece of irrefutable, secret intelligence to either confirm the machine's truth or expose its fatal lie. The moment the screens in the Serpico 15 bunker illuminated with the chilling, sequential warnings, "Launch, launch, launch," Petrov knew he was standing in the most solitary place on Earth. The countdown to oblivion was not a future scenario. It was a present, screaming reality. His training had been ruthless. Eliminate variables, trust the machine, and execute the pre-approved doctrine of immediate, overwhelming retaliation. Yet, as the fifth signal flared into existence on his console, the familiar obedience that had defined his career fractured under the weight of an unexpected piece of logic. The system's logic was relentless. 5 confirmed launches. This was the unmistakable signature of a concerted, decapitating first strike. The exact nightmare scenario the Soviet system was designed to repel with instant, massive retaliation. The computer's logic was flawless, the number was undeniable, the threat was massive, and the response had to be instant. But it was precisely the number 5 that snagged on the fine wire of Petrov's military intuition. Why 5? The strategic absurdity was overwhelming. He ran the numbers in his mind, stripping away the panic and the political paranoia. If the United States were truly launching a surprise, strategic nuclear first strike aimed at obliterating the Soviet Union's command and control structure, they would not send a mere 5 missiles. They would launch an overwhelming salvo, hundreds of missiles, targeting every known Soviet military facility, major city, and communication hub simultaneously. To launch only 5 would be a strategically suicidal attack, guaranteeing the attacker's own destruction once the fully armed Soviet reserve forces responded. It was an act of war that made no strategic sense whatsoever. The entire Soviet defense philosophy was predicated on the understanding that any American first strike would be catastrophic and total. The American arsenal contained thousands of warheads. A launch of only 5 was akin to challenging a sleeping bear with a small pebble. It lacked the necessary military arrogance, the requisite commitment to annihilation that defined the Cold War. It did not make sense. In the pressurized silence of the bunker, the procedural clock had not stopped. Every second Petrov spent contemplating this strategic paradox was a second the General Secretary lost to the decision on launching Soviet missiles. The time window was non-negotiable, 25 minutes from the first plume detection to the missiles landing on Soviet soil. They were already several minutes deep into that terrifying calculation, the air thick with anticipation, the piercing shriek of the alarm now a continuous, throbbing physical presence behind his eyes. His jaw was clenched, the tendons standing out against the pale, low light. Petrov's subordinates, the junior officers, communications specialists, and radar technicians, were staring at him, their faces pale, their breath held, their training overridden by the sheer, existential terror of the blinking red light. Their duty was to report what the machine told them. They were ready to relay his confirmation up the chain. They needed his single, definitive word, the single code of confirmation that would set the world on its path to annihilation. He felt the collective weight of their terrified obedience pressing against him, their silence a profound demand for action. He knew that the general staff waiting above him, the men ultimately responsible for the counterlaunch, were staring at geopolitical models that painted the image of the treacherous American attack. Those commanders would not be concerned with spectral analysis or strategic paradoxes. They would be governed by a single, terrifying principle. In the nuclear age, hesitation equals defeat. To them, the blinking red light was an order, not a suggestion. The pressure on Petrov was not just from the machine, but from the entire, fearful Soviet establishment. Petrov's immediate crucial task was to determine the level of certainty. The system presented him with an insurmountable wall of certainties. First, the technological certainty. The Oko satellite system was green-lit by the Politburo and tested ruthlessly, designed not to fail. Second, the procedural certainty. His internal manual dictated that multiple launch warnings demanded immediate escalation. And finally, the geopolitical certainty. In the aftermath of Call 007 and facing Able Archer 83, an American sneak attack was considered a high probability. Facing all these certainties, Petrov clung to his sole, fragile uncertainty, the logical inconsistency of the small number. The entire defense apparatus, the entire doctrine of deterrence, was built to protect against the massive, overwhelming strike. It had no contingency for a limited, nonsensical act of aggression. The sheer illogical nature of the 5 launches was, paradoxically, the only thing preventing a fully logical, world-ending response. The temptation to simply follow protocol was immense. It was the safe, professionally correct choice. If he followed the manual and relayed the confirmation, and the missiles turned out to be real, he would be the hero who saved the Soviet Union from utter ruin, his name immortalized in stone. If he disobeyed, and the missiles were real, he would be a traitor, responsible for the destruction of the motherland and his own family. The professional incentive was entirely aligned with the machine's verdict. The military training had been designed to strip away the individual's conscience and replace it with the collective's will. The logic was cold but persuasive. The computer does not lie. Every simulation, every drill, every Soviet manual demanded immediate action. To assume the computer was wrong was not just a technical error. It was a profound act of political subversion that could easily be construed as espionage or sabotage. The chain of command was waiting, relying on the established certainty that the system was reporting a large-scale retaliatory attack, which the computers believed was the only logical U.S. response. His only possible shield was the thin hope that the ground radar, still quiet, would confirm his doubt. But he knew that the radar had limitations. The American launch site, likely somewhere like Malmstrom Air Force Base in Montana or a submarine off the coast, meant the missiles would remain below the radar horizon for critical minutes. This lack of radar confirmation was not proof of error. It was merely a temporary silence in the face of an imminent threat. The satellites had the line of sight. The satellites had the data. The data demanded launch. The logical, trained response was to assume the radar would catch the missiles within the next few minutes, confirming the threat and making Petrov's hesitation look like catastrophic cowardice. The decision was no longer military, it was psychological. It came down to a simple, unwritten code of conduct: the human factor. The Soviet system had invested billions of rubles into eliminating the very human elements of doubt, fear, and philosophical consideration from the response chain. And now, the fate of the world rested entirely on one man's defiant reintroduction of that human factor. The pressure built into the Cold War structure meant that there was no off-ramp for sanity. The only path forward, according to every document and every expert, was mutual assured destruction, MAD. Petrov's internal struggle was the confrontation between a flawless machine and an imperfect but reasoning man. The machine had the facts, the man had the context, and in this terrifying scenario, context was the only truth that mattered. The heavy red telephone sat waiting. The screen screamed high probability. Petrov had used up almost every minute of his available decision time. He was operating in the final, desperate window of the 25-minute clock, a zone where official procedure had vanished and only raw, naked responsibility remained. The cold dread that had gripped him earlier was now a burning fever of concentrated thought, pushing against his skull. He had to act immediately, but his action absolutely could not be a confirmation. He needed to deliver a single, defiant code word that challenged the very truth of the machine. His confirmation was the single human action required to authorize the annihilation of the West and guarantee the retaliatory destruction of the East. The clock was still ticking, and the system demanded action with every blaring frequency. The metallic air in the bunker felt tight and electrified, a physical manifestation of the impending catastrophe. He needed a code word, a piece of irrefutable, secret intelligence to either confirm the machine's truth or expose its fatal lie. The tension in the room was physically palpable. The subordinates around him were frozen in postures of silent terror, their collective will waiting for his single command to plunge the world into darkness. They were, in this moment, merely extensions of the machine's flawed logic. The crisis had stripped away everything but the central, irreducible question: does this make sense? This was the unauthorized, unwritten code of conduct that now governed the planet's fate, a simple piece of human logic that the automated system was structurally incapable of processing. He was asking the machine for sanity, and the machine only spoke probability and fear, translating the statistical anomaly into an existential threat. The moment of discovery wasn't a flash of technical genius. It was a psychological leap rooted in historical and strategic perspective. Petrov realized the colossal flaw in the automated system was rooted in a failure of strategic imagination. The system was designed to see any attack, but it had no filter for the scope or logic of that attack. The designers, brilliant engineers fearful of missing any single threat, had tragically failed to account for the necessary political brutality of an actual surprise attack. He decided that the small number, just 5 confirmed launches, was the true secret code word that indicated a system malfunction. A real, massive U.S. strike, aimed at achieving decapitation and neutralization of the Soviet response, would deploy hundreds of missiles simultaneously to ensure total Soviet capitulation. The limited number was the statistical absurdity, the glaring red flag of human common sense. If war was coming, it would not be a hesitant act of aggression. It would be a thunderstorm, not a few drops of rain. The magnitude of the response must match the magnitude of the threat, and 5 missiles did not justify the annihilation of the planet. It defied the ironclad principle of first strike efficacy, an act only a computer or a madman would attempt. This was his aha moment. He didn't have technical proof, only a probability rooted in the strategic logic of the enemy, which the computer could not interpret. He defied the entire multi-billion ruble system, betting his career, his life, and the world on the idea that the electronic truth was a philosophical lie. He was betting on the enemy's strategic competence being superior to his own system's programming. The fate of every living soul was wagered on an assumption about American military competence. His action was simple, precise, and treasonous. He logged the event not as a confirmed launch, but as a system failure, and then forced the technicians to investigate, defying all procedure. He had absolutely no right to make this call. His manual explicitly forbade it. He was meant to pass the warning up, not dissect it on the spot. He had usurped the authority of the General Secretary in favor of common sense, making himself the single, unauthorized arbiter of global life and death. The decision was not based on any military code word known to the KGB or the CIA. It was based on the courage to say, "The computer is wrong," using the sheer, insufficient scale of the presumed attack as his irrefutable evidence. The true hero was his quiet, unauthorized decision to log the event as a system failure and force the technicians to investigate, defying all procedure. Narrate this internal discovery with immense focus. The highest stakes decision in history was based on the simple question, does this make sense? The survival of every living thing hung on his calculated descent. He reached for the microphone connected to the command headquarters. His hand, which had been frozen in indecision, now moved with a sudden, final certainty. His voice was quiet, steady, and utterly authoritative, dismissing the machine's truth in favor of human logic. The code he spoke was a lie, a necessary, life-saving lie about a system malfunction, but the message it conveyed to his superiors was the truth. Do not launch. He had just bought the world enough time for the truth to catch up to the fear. Petrov's action was simple, precise, and treasonous. He logged the event not as a confirmed launch, but as a system failure, and then forced the technicians to investigate, defying all procedure. He had absolutely no right to make this call. His manual explicitly forbade it. He was meant to pass the warning up, not dissect it on the spot. He had usurped the authority of the General Secretary in favor of common sense, making himself the single, unauthorized arbiter of global life and death. He had just delivered a single, unauthorized code word, a life-saving lie, that purchased the world a few minutes of desperate, agonizing time. The seconds that followed were the most critical in modern history. Petrov's gamble was validated in the agonizing minutes that followed. While he held the line, refusing to escalate, the technicians scrambled within the bunker's chilled network to verify the OCO satellite data, desperately looking for the real-world fire plumes that should have been visible from over-the-horizon radar installations across the Soviet Union. The air thrummed with a nervous energy, the subordinates' silence now heavier, weighted not just by fear, but by the dawning understanding that their commander had committed a monumental act of heresy. Every officer in the room knew that the delay Petrov mandated had placed their entire nation's defense at risk. The atmosphere was a volatile mix of raw terror and professional duty, a psychological pressure cooker where every glance was a judgment. Petrov stood firm, his gaze fixed on the radar screens that still showed nothing. The delay began to argue in his favor. They found nothing. The ground radar sites, the secondary confirmation network, all remained silent, tracking only atmospheric disturbances and civilian air traffic. There was no visible launch signature. The non-confirmation of the radar began, slowly, to argue in Petrov's favor. The logical flaw he had sensed, that 5 missiles was too few for a first strike, began to gain physical weight against the machine's electronic certainty. The silence of the radar screens was now the only tangible truth opposing the screaming lie of the computer console. But the most humiliating and terrifying truth was still to come. What the technicians eventually found, burrowing into the intricate satellite telemetry, was the flaw itself, a rare specific geometric alignment of sunlight hitting high-altitude cloud formations above North America. This particular conjunction created a massive, transient optical reflection that the satellite's infrared sensors interpreted as the incandescent plume of a missile launch. The thermal signature was so clean, so precise, that it was identical to a Minuteman III engine. It was the technical blind spot that Petrov had dismissed during training but trusted in the crisis. It was a statistical anomaly that had been magnified by geopolitical paranoia into an instrument of annihilation. The billion-dollar defensive apparatus of the Soviet Union, the pinnacle of their military engineering, had been fooled by light, by a simple, unthreatening astronomical phenomenon. The computer was technically correct that it saw something with the thermal signature of a missile, but philosophically, it was catastrophically wrong. The system had not simply malfunctioned, it had been tricked by a sunbeam. The sophisticated, layered billion-dollar defensive apparatus of the Soviet Union had been rendered useless by a natural phenomenon, a piece of astronomical geometry that the system was designed to ignore. The fear that saved the world was not the computer's fear of attack, but Petrov's fear of an illogical counterattack. He had trusted the enemy's strategic logic more than his own nation's defensive programming, and in doing so, he chose life over the terrifying rigidity of the Cold War machine. The crisis passed, the missiles stayed silent in their deep concrete silos, and the world remained whole, unaware that it had been saved by one man's defiant doubt. But in the rigid, unforgiving world of Soviet certainty, where the machine was sacred and human judgment was suspect, there was no medal for being right when the machine was wrong. Petrov had been right, but his unauthorized decision was a grave and inexcusable breach of sacred military protocol. He had logged the incident incorrectly, bypassed multiple layers of command designed explicitly to prevent such personal intervention, and most dangerously, he had introduced human judgment into a process that was engineered to be purely mechanical and instantaneous. The system could tolerate a catastrophic technical error by a machine that could be fixed with new code, but it could not tolerate such a profound act of defiance by a man. His very existence exposed the flaw in the entire strategic doctrine. The Politburo and the highest echelons of the Soviet military command could not publicly admit that its cutting-edge, trillion-ruble early warning system had been nearly triggered by a simple cosmic phenomenon, a sunbeam reflecting off high-altitude clouds. This would have been a humiliating technical defeat and an embarrassing display of weakness to the West, especially in the atmosphere of heightened tension following the Kylo 07 tragedy and the upcoming Able Archer, 83, exercise. Such an admission would have fatally undermined the image of Soviet technological infallibility, a core pillar of their superpower status. The institutional response was swift and absolute: cover-up. The crisis was immediately and permanently classified, and the secret was buried under layers of bureaucracy, vanishing into the deep, inaccessible archives of the Soviet state. The entire duty log for that night was seized. The truth was deemed less important than maintaining the facade of Soviet military perfection and technological infallibility. The system had to be correct, even if reality suggested otherwise. The punishment for being correct was delivered not with fanfare, but with the cold, bureaucratic finality of a closing file cabinet. Petrov was neither promoted nor publicly praised. Instead, he was scrutinized, subjected to intense questioning that focused not on the near war, but on procedural minutiae. He was disciplined for improperly filling out the logbook, officially cited for the very act of unauthorized deviation that saved millions of lives. The system needed him to be a hero when the crisis was active, but an obedient, disposable functionary when the inquest began. The world was saved, but the hero was sent home with a scolding and the silent termination of his career. The evidence of his foresight, the catastrophic failure of the Oko satellite system, was overwhelming. Technicians, working under immense pressure and secrecy, confirmed that a rare solar alignment had indeed fooled the system, rendering the entire defensive apparatus useless at that crucial time. Petrov had been vindicated by fact, but the cost was his career. The truth remained locked in the bunker's silent archive, a testament to the single, audacious guess that stood against the logic of two superpowers. The secret was buried for years, hidden beneath the Iron Curtain, preventing either Washington or Moscow from truly understanding how close they had come to the flashpoint. The military planners on both sides continued to operate under the assumption of their system's infallible electronic certainty, unaware that the entire strategic balance was dependent on the unauthorized common sense of one Soviet lieutenant colonel. The fact that the ultimate strategic safety measure, the human factor, was operating outside the official rulebook was the greatest weakness and the greatest strength of the Cold War. The cost was profound. Petrov was pushed into retirement, his career prematurely ended, his patriotic service erased from the active record. When the story finally emerged years later, Stanislav Petrov was found living a meager life in a small, nondescript Soviet apartment, his extraordinary moment of global heroism unknown even to his closest neighbors. He never sought glory, stating simply that he was only doing his job, which, ironically, meant doing the exact opposite of what his job description demanded. The price he paid was obscurity and professional humiliation, a tiny personal coin compared to the infinite value of the lives he saved. Yet, the consequence of Petrov's quiet defiance was the most profound piece in human history, the confirmation that a single life, focused not on rigid procedure but on common sense, could override the terrifying certainty of total war. His action did not create a new treaty, it simply proved that, at the ultimate moment of decision, the human factor was the single, most critical component of global defense. The profound irony is this. The US and Soviets spent trillions of dollars building systems designed to eliminate human hesitation, only to be saved by the simplest and most human of instincts, doubt. The final code word was not a technical bypass, it was the courage to say, "The computer is wrong. The man who broke the rules defined the peace." He never received a military honor from his government for the incident. When the story finally emerged years later, Stanislav Petrov was living a meager life in a small Soviet apartment. He never sought glory, stating simply that he was only doing his job, which, ironically, meant doing the exact opposite of what his job description demanded. The world was not saved by a treaty, nor by a technological genius, but by an officer who listened to a psychological paradox. He refused to believe that the ultimate act of war could be launched with such a paltry, illogical force. He chose sanity over the system, and in doing so, he defined the necessary, irreducible value of the human factor. The missile stayed silent. The final, powerful legacy of the secret code word is this. It reminds us that the best defense against annihilation may not be a machine's infallible logic, but the humble, courageous doubt of a single man. The man who broke the rules, allowed the world to live. The profound conclusion is this. When faced with the terrifying certainty of a machine built for destruction, always bet on the quiet intelligence of the human mind. The silence of the saved world is his enduring monument.